In the early morning hours of September 1st, 1939, German air and ground forces advanced across the border with Poland, thus marking the beginning of the Second World War. 2 days later, the people of Britain listened anxiously as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke to the nation and announced England's declaration of war against Germany.
At this time, we transfer you to London for an important announcement by the British Prime Minister.
Up to the very last, it would have been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honorable settlement between Germany and Poland, but Hitler would not have it.
10 months later, as Hitler's generals prepared for an invasion of the British Isles, the German Luftwaffe began its campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and gain air superiority over the English Channel. The heroic defense mounted by the RAF came to be known as the Battle of Britain. From July through October of 1940, men and machines fought to the death in the skies above England, until withering German losses caused Hitler to cancel the invasion plans. On the other side of the Atlantic, most people in the United States preferred to think that they could simply isolate themselves from world events. With the memories of World War I and the Great Depression still fresh in their minds, the thought of new foreign entanglements frightened most Americans. Still, President Franklin Roosevelt could see the war clouds gathering and began gearing up America's industrial might for what he knew was the inevitable conflict to come. The call to military service was also being sounded, and recruitment posters began appearing everywhere. Although there was great fear of a coming war with Germany, the ranks of the Army and Navy began to swell with new recruits. Among those who watched these earth-shattering events unfold were the students at Bloomfield High School in Bloomfield, New Jersey. In particular was a sophomore named Henry Wedaa.
Well, before the war started in 1939, there had been expectations of a European war for many years. Some people generally believed that Hitler would eventually start a war, so few were surprised when Germany invaded Poland.
Hank Wedaa was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey on February 15, 1924. The oldest of 5 children born to Henry and Anna Wedaa, Hank discovered his love for aviation at a very early age.
Well, I think I was always interested in aviation. I think that's because where we lived in New Jersey, we had a golf course behind our house, and airplanes were constantly landing there when they ran out of gasoline or had engine problems. We always took advantage of the opportunity to talk to pilots and see their airplanes.
As Hank and his fellow high school students watched Nazi Germany conquer country after country, he knew the day would come when he would be taking to the skies with the Army Air Corps. He didn't have to wait long. The morning of December 7th, 1941 began like almost every other day in Hawaii, sunny, warm, and peaceful. But just before 8 a.m., the soldiers and sailors stationed on this idyllic paradise were jolted as waves of Japanese planes began attacking Pearl Harbor. An hour and a half later, the attack was over, leaving 18 Navy ships destroyed and over 3,500 Americans dead or wounded. A continent away, it was a chilly winter afternoon in New Jersey.
Well, I remember that it was too cold to caddy at the golf course, so I was home, listening to a football game, when the announcer interrupted to tell us that Pearl Harbor was under attack by the Japanese, and that an undeclared state of war existed between the United States and Japan. Well, after America entered the war, there was a nationwide movement by young men to join the various services and fight our common enemies. Millions of people volunteered to go and fight the war. Industry started tooling up, and the vaunted production capabilities of our industrial society were assembled to provide the tools of war, not only to our military, but also to those of our allies.
Immediately after America declared war on the Axis powers, young men began appearing at recruiting stations in droves. Those who didn't volunteer were subject to the draft, which Roosevelt had signed into law in 1940.
Well, after graduating from high school, I started negotiating with my Army contacts to allow me to join the Army Air Force. We reached agreement, and they told me to appear at Fort Dix in January of 1943. I appeared, and they said all bets were off, since they needed infantrymen for the coming invasion, and they shipped me off to Nashville, Tennessee for basic training. Well, shortly after arriving at Nashville, I saw a building with an Air Force sign on it. I went in and explained my problem, and they said, "Sign here." I did, and they said, "You are now in the Army Air Force." I took some tests and was sent to both Bombardier and Gunnery School.
Once Hank had secured his transfer to the Army Air Corps, he was put on a train for the trip to Aviation Ground School in Houston, Texas. It was February 1943. As a young aviation cadet, he spent 3 months learning the basics of military aviation. He also spent 3 months in Laredo, learning to be an airplane machine gunner.
Well, I thought both schools were really interesting. At Gunnery School in Laredo, Texas, it was fun learning to shoot a .50 caliber machine gun, as well as taking it apart in a dark room and reassembling it to operating condition. At Bombardier School in Midland, Texas, it was interesting learning how to drop bombs accurately on a target.
Hank's next stop was in Midland, Texas, where he attended bombing school. After 4 months learning the intricacies of precision bombing, Hank graduated with a commission as a second lieutenant. After a short leave to visit his family, Hank found himself assigned to the newly formed 467th Bomb Group based in Wendover, Utah.
This was the most godforsaken base we had ever seen, more than 100 miles due west of Salt Lake City at the California-Nevada border. Population 100, maybe. Cold, desolate, windy, muddy, lived in cold concert huts, terrible living conditions. We were all happy when it was time to move on to our next base.
After 4 grueling months of intense training, the 467th was ready to make its way to Europe. During his training, Hank had learned to truly appreciate the B-24 Liberator.
Well, at Wichita, Kansas, we got our final bomb group inspection from the Air Force, so we were free to depart the United States, which we did at 11 p.m. on February 15, 1944, my 20th birthday. Well, the B-24 was first conceived in 1939, 4.5 years after the B-17, to meet the Air Force requirements for a second heavy bomber. The B-24 carried a heavier bomb load. It was also faster and had a much longer range than the B-17. It had a crew of 10, and its maximum speed was 303 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It was capable of carrying a bomb load of 5,000 pounds, a distance of 1,700 miles at 25,000 feet. Each aircraft carried 10 50 caliber machine guns for defense.
For American airmen heading to Europe, the route was long and complex. From Utah to Kansas, to Florida to Trinidad, and then on to Brazil for the transatlantic crossing to Africa.
Well, the only thing we could see along the way were the forests of Brazil, which were every bit as dense as I would expect a forest to be. Also, I'd never before or since encountered as much clear air turbulence as we did over these forests. Well, after leaving Brazil, we had a very boring flight across the South Atlantic to Dakar in West Africa. A few days later, we departed for Marrakesh. This was our final stop before flying to the last leg of our trip to our new base in England near Rackheath, which is near Norwich.
After all 58 aircraft of the 467th arrived at Rackheath, near the city of Norwich in northeast England, the crews began to settle into their new homes.
At Rockies, we were assigned to various Nissan huts, nothing very elaborate, but adequate, with a big coal-burning potbelly stove to heat the building. There were 8 officers from 2 flight crews assigned to each hut. Our base had just been completed the week before we arrived, so it was brand new. Interestingly enough, during the nighttime we could hear things dropping on the steel roof. We soon learned that it was the fragments from the anti-aircraft guns of Norwich that were defending the city from attack by German bombers. We used to go out in the morning and pick up the fragments that slid to the ground from the roof.
Despite the months of intense preparation, the 467th still was not approved for operations.
Before we could fly our first combat mission, we had to learn the procedure for operating aircraft so we could take off and land without hitting each other. This was very important since the weather in England was always very cloudy, so you couldn't see other nearby aircraft. During the flight assembly process for a mission, for example, we would follow around a radio beacon while climbing to altitude through cloud cover that was often 3 to 4 miles thick. Well, we also learned how to fly really close together in formation. This enabled us to concentrate our guns on an attacking aircraft. The German Air Force pilots soon learned to find targets that did not fly in tight formations. Our group leader understood this and had us flying tight formations all the time.
Finally, on April 10, 1944, the 467th Bomb Group was ready. Their first combat mission was to bomb an aircraft production plant in the French city of Bourget.
A flight crew briefing was held at 6 a.m. in the morning. Since this was our first mission, we didn't know what to expect. As we approached the continent, we were extra alert. We flew deep into France, past the city of Paris, where we could see the Eiffel Tower, and onto the target, where we bombed successfully. We encountered no flak, and all planes arrived back at base without any problems. Thank goodness.
During the next 2.5 months, Hank and his crew completed the required 30 missions in one of the shortest time periods of the war. In just 78 days, Hank bombed targets in France, Germany, and Belgium. On every trip, Hank's bombardier position in the nose gun turret of the B-24 gave him a front row seat to the battle that raged around him.
Well, it was interesting to see the difference in the number of airplanes that went to a specific target. When attacking a small, lightly defended target, 100 airplanes were enough. And you could look around and see most of the airplanes. However, for well-defended targets such as Berlin, 1,000 or more planes were usually sent in a line of aircraft, stretching over 100 miles or so. We were always alert with these large formations, since the Germans would surely send fighters up to intercept us as soon as possible. They went after those groups first, who were not flying close together before their bombs were dropped. All this was going on, the anti-aircraft guns were firing at the aircraft in the lead as they entered the target area. The aircraft that were first over the target were in the safest position because the Germans had not determined the precise altitude at which they were flying. If you were tail end Charlie, the altitude that had been established and the aircraft loss rate was higher.
In the days leading up to the D-Day invasion of Normandy, an important target for the 467th was the launch sites for the German V-1 rockets. These terror weapons were hurled at England from both fixed and mobile launchers in France, Holland, and Belgium.
While we were there, Hitler launched the first of his secret weapons. This was the V-1, a large flying bomb with wings and a crude timing system to control an internal combustion engine. They were launched from various locations on the continent with a timed flight. When the time was up, the engine cut off, and the bomb hit whatever happened to be in its way. As they flew over our base, we were not concerned, as long as we could hear the engine running. When it stopped, everyone ran for cover.
The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, was the biggest amphibious assault ever mounted, with 160,000 Allied troops entering France from the sea and another 24,000 by parachute airdrop. The role of the 8th Air Force on D-Day was to soften up the German defenses and to bomb roads and rail lines in order to disrupt enemy counterattacks and reinforcements.
Well, we bombed at dawn, and it was very difficult to see the target. But as we headed back to our base over the continent, I had a bird's eye view of the tremendous Allied invasion forces in the English Channel on their way to France. Thousands of boats. Fortunately, we encountered little flak and no fighter opposition. A week later, we were sent on what was to become a memorable mission, where we attacked a bridge and successfully destroyed it from an altitude of just 6,500 feet.
Despite the tension and fear of aerial combat, most air crews decorated their planes with creative and, well, sometimes humorous nose art. Sadly, many of the 487's missions claimed at least one aircraft lost to flak or fighters. As the end of June of 1944 neared, Hank's crew got the mission they'd been waiting for: Berlin.
The raid on Berlin on June 21st, 1944 was the only Berlin mission that I participated in. From many points of view, this was our most important mission. We were attacking the heart of the German war machine, and we knew there would be a lot of opposition, and there was. Our target was the rail yard in the city. On the way to Berlin, we flew past the fuel storage tanks in Hamburg, which we had bombed 10 days earlier. They were still burning, and the smoke from these fires reached our altitude. As we approached the city, the flak guns started going after the aircraft miles in front of us. By the time we were over the target, the air was filled with smoke, and our squadron started receiving heavy flak damage to some aircraft. There were also some German fighters aloft. I saw them considering whether to attack our group, but they went after other aircraft that were flying in looser patterns. We flew back to our base successfully.
The bombing of Berlin was Hank's 26th mission. During the next week, he would fly 4 more, completing the coveted 30th mission on June 28th with a raid on the railroad yards at Saarbrücken, Germany.
Well, the real meaning of 30 missions completed was that the war was really over for us, and it would be sending us back to the United States for reassignment. However, before doing this, they had an award ceremony, which we were each awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and an air medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, as well as a promotion to first lieutenant in my case. They sent me to Scotland to get on the Queen Elizabeth first for the trip back to the United States. We arrived in New York City on July 15th, 1944, exactly 5 months to the day that we left for Florida. I then went home for a 2-week leave, followed by 30 days rest and recreation in Atlantic City, New Jersey. I was then assigned to Clovis, New Mexico Air Base as a bombardier trainer, but that was boring. I was bored training bombardier students, so I requested and received a transfer to a B-29 group in Tucson that was heading for Japan. So we attended many ground school classes to educate us about the aircraft and flew many flights to acquaint us with how the aircraft operated. We had almost completed our training when the war ended. Shortly after the announcement, I was discharged.
After World War II ended, Hank stayed in the reserve until the 1950s, finishing up his Air Force career as a captain. Today, Hank reflects back proudly on his service to his country and on the warriors he flew with.
Well, after the war, there was no need for all the B-24s and all the other aircraft. Most of them were simply melted down. A very few survive today, and for me, it is something I always look for when one of the old warbirds comes to town.
Though time has taken its toll on the men and machines who fought the battles of the skies, there's still great interest in preserving these memories for future generations. The Collings Foundation of Stowe, Massachusetts is a nonprofit educational foundation that acquires, restores, and preserves military aircraft from the First World War through today. Hank has been an active supporter of the Collings Foundation and never misses a chance to see the Foundation's B-24 Liberator when it visits a local airport on one of its annual nationwide tours. In the hectic pace of our modern lives, it's hard to find time for simple reflection. To pause long enough to consider the time and space in which we exist, and to quietly ponder the monumental events that have shaped our nation and our world. Sadly, our memories of World War II are fading so quickly now. The greatest conflict in the history of mankind is confined now to textbooks, the occasional movie, and the recollections of the survivors who are still with us. We must never be allowed to forget the enormous sacrifices that average Americans made during the war, both at home and on the battlefield.